The 14th of October 1944, 2:17 a.m., Philippine Sea. Inside the narrow control room of a U.S. fleet submarine, the red combat lights washed over sweating faces and vibrating steel. The USS Marlin, nicknamed the Destroyer Killer by a handful of crews who'd heard rumors, sat at 180 feet, engines silent, drifting through cold black water. Sonar operator Ethan Ward pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, heart thumping in the same rhythm as the sonar pulses echoing through the hull. Ping, 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 closing fast. Ward whispered, 2 screws, no 3, destroyers. Lieutenant Commander Hale didn't look up from the periscope well. Bearing? 240. Speed increasing. They're hunting us. The Marlin wasn't supposed to be here, not in this narrow corridor where Japanese escorts swept the sea every night, not this close to the shipping route feeding the enemy's last remaining strongholds. The textbook said a sub caught in shallow water should run silent, dive deeper, and hope luck stayed on its side. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you for choosing to watch my channel when there are so many other creators out there. Once again, I sincerely thank you, and I hope you can support me with a subscription and leave a comment with the number 1 after you finish listening to this story. Thank you very much. But luck hadn't saved the American boats earlier that week. 3 U.S. submarines had vanished in this same stretch after being cornered by Japanese. Type 93 destroyers, fast, aggressive, and armed with sonar refined far beyond what naval intelligence had predicted. Another ping ripped through the hull. The steel deck plates trembled. Range is closing. Under 900 yards, Ward reported. In the dim red light, Hale exhaled once, slow and controlled. He'd been at sea long enough to know when doctrine wouldn't save him. The Japanese had found them, and with 3 destroyers above each, ready to rake the ocean with depth charges, the Marlin had minutes, maybe seconds, before the first pattern dropped. A young helmsman muttered, "We dive deeper?" "Negative," Hale said. "They'll box us in." "But sir, the manual..." "I'm not interested in the manual." For a moment, the crew froze. A U.S. submarine facing multiple destroyers was expected to run, not fight. Running was survival. Running was logic. Running was the only thing approved by the Navy. Hale gripped the chart table, eyes locked on the bearing plot. "They think we're prey," he said quietly, "so we're going to hit them first." Ward swallowed. "Sir, you want to attack destroyers from inside their search pattern?" The commander nodded once. "They won't expect it, and if we time it right, they won't live long enough to react." Above them, another ping struck the hull like a hammer on a church bell. "Prepare tubes 1 through 4, Hale ordered. "Set depth 12 feet. Stand by for a fast shot." A silence rolled through the control room, thick, electric, unreal. The kind of silence that comes right before history splits in two. And in the next 48 hours, the USS Marlin would do something no submarine in the Pacific had ever done. It would wipe out 10 ships and leave the Imperial Japanese Navy stunned. Dawn was still hours away as the USS Marlin drifted beneath the Philippine Sea, holding a fragile stillness, while 3 Japanese destroyers swept the surface above in tight hunting circles, meant to choke off any attempt at escape. The chart table glowed faintly under the red combat lights, illuminating the narrow space where Lieutenant Commander Hale studied enemy patterns that had grown deadlier with every passing week of the campaign. The U.S. Navy knew the Japanese convoy routes along this corridor were tightening, but few understood how aggressively the Imperial Navy had begun protecting them after suffering catastrophic losses during previous months. Each remaining transport carried ammunition, aviation fuel, or reinforcements meant to prolong the defense of Luzon, making this stretch of ocean the final artery feeding the Japanese front line. Hale had memorized the intelligence reports describing these convoys as heavily shielded formations, often composed of 6 to 8 merchant ships guarded by destroyers that rotated in layered patterns designed to trap aggressive American submarines. Those destroyers held the newest Type 93 sonar, a system far more sensitive than early assessments had acknowledged, allowing them to detect even disciplined, silent-running boats at ranges the U.S. Navy had never anticipated. Inside the Marlin's control room, every man knew exactly what those reports implied. If the submarine surfaced too quickly, it would be illuminated by searchlights. If it descended too deep, it risked crushing pressure. And if it remained stationary, the Japanese would simply triangulate its position until a barrage of depth charges forced it upward to die in the blinding spotlight of gunfire. The sea outside felt unnervingly alive, as though each vibration of the Marlin's hull carried a whispered reminder that thousands of tons of water pressed against the steel skin, separating 40 men from oblivion. Ward, still glued to the hydrophones, heard layered machinery above him, high-speed screws, subtle rudder shifts, and the hard metallic chorus of destroyers turning aggressively to close the kill box around their unseen target. Hale marked their angles calmly, aware that every degree of movement mattered when a submarine was trapped inside a three-dimensional cage, forged from sonar beams and timed attack patterns. He glanced once at the depth gauge and once at the helmsman, measuring not only the Marlin's position but also the crew's fraying nerves, as the hours pressed forward with relentless tension. The situation would have been daunting for any U.S. submarine. Yet the Marlin faced an even harsher truth. She was alone, operating ahead of the nearest friendly boat by nearly 200 miles, with limited radio contact and no expectation of rescue if cornered. This isolation sharpened every sound echoing through the hull, making each ping from the destroyers feel like a hammer blow, forecasting the moment the enemy would finally pinpoint their depth. Still, the crew understood why they were here. The convoy passing through this corridor represented more than simple tonnage. It carried the supplies necessary to reinforce airfields capable of striking American invasion forces, gathering months ahead of schedule. Destroying that convoy could cripple Japanese plans, shortening the battle for Luzon and saving thousands of American soldiers who would soon fight their way onto contested beaches. As the sonar pings grew faster, Hale inhaled once, steady but deliberate, accepting the burden of the decision he had already made. The textbook said the Marlin should run, yet every instinct told him that running would waste the one narrow window where he held surprise on his side. Above them, the destroyers continued their tightening hunt, unaware that the submarine they believed trapped had quietly chosen to become the hunter. That choice would define everything that happened next. The tightening pattern of pings hammered through the Marlin's steel frame until every man aboard felt the rhythm vibrating in his ribs, announcing with unnerving clarity that the destroyers above had narrowed the search grid to a lethal degree. Ward kept his eyes locked on the oscilloscope, watching the jagged spikes rise and fall as the enemy's sonar sweeps grew sharper, carrying a confidence that suggested the Japanese captains believed they were moments from forcing the submarine to reveal its position. In the cramped control room, sailors shifted anxiously at their stations, exchanging quick glances that betrayed the pressure building inside the hull as depth-charge tracks began clattering into place on the destroyers above. Each metallic scrape echoed faintly through the water, creating a dreadful anticipation that swelled with every second of silence that followed. The helmsman's hands trembled slightly as he held the Marlin steady, knowing a sudden course change could echo loudly enough to betray their depth, yet remaining still too long would let the Japanese triangulate the submarine's heartbeat against the ocean floor. Hale monitored the tension carefully, aware that even the most disciplined crew could crack when pinned beneath enemy ships, equipped with superior sonar and a reputation for ruthlessness. Suddenly, a sharp spike on Ward's scope made him flinch before blurting, "Destroyer turning hard to port bearing 230 closing fast." His voice rose despite his effort to stay calm, and the entire control room responded with instinctive rigidity as men braced against the coming impact of an attack pattern they had no room to outrun. A low tremor rippled through the Marlin's hull as the first destroyer passed overhead, its screw wash rumbling like distant thunder, while its sonar beam cut a precise arc through the black water. The pressure inside the submarine shifted with the movement, creating a momentary sensation of sinking even though the depth gauge barely changed. Then a shouted report came from the aft compartment, where the auxiliary systems crew struggled to keep pumps quiet despite the mounting strain on the ballast tanks. "Minor vibration starboard aft," the sailor called, his tone tight, but machinery noise still under threshold. Everyone knew that threshold was razor thin, and a single mechanical hiccup could send a reverberation powerful enough to betray them. A second destroyer swept across the Marlin's bow, and this time the sonar ping struck the hull with a clarity that felt almost tactile, as though the steel skin of the submarine had been slapped by an invisible hand. Hale stiffened at the intensity of the echo, recognizing it as a sign that the destroyer's sonar officer had narrowed the beam specifically to confirm a faint return he'd likely noticed moments earlier. Tension climbed further when the signalman whispered, "Sir, they know something's here." His words hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be carried out, and no one in the room contradicted him, because deep down every man understood that the destroyers were not casting blind anymore. They were closing in deliberately, guided by experience and murderous precision. The intercom crackled as the engine room reported a minor rise in temperature around the reduction gears, a subtle warning that the silent running regime was straining internal systems beyond their comfort zone. Hale gave a slow nod, understanding that even silence had a cost, and the longer they stayed still, the more the submarine itself fought against the unnatural quiet demanded for survival. As another ping slammed into the hull, louder and more focused than the others, Hale realized the Japanese destroyers were not merely searching, they were converging, tightening a noose designed to choke the Marlin into panic. And in that stifling moment, every man aboard understood that a single mistake, a single vibration, or a single breath too loud could condemn them all to a steel grave on the ocean floor. Yet the commander also sensed something else beneath the fear and the pressure and the oppressive weight of the sea, an emerging resolve that matched his own, a shared understanding that they were nearing the moment when running would no longer be possible and fighting would become the only path left. The oppressive tension inside the Marlin only grew heavier as Hale considered the rigid doctrines drilled into every submarine officer since the earliest days of the Pacific Campaign, where survival depended on strict obedience to procedures crafted by men who expected their captains to run rather than challenge the enemy at close range. The manuals outlined each response with clinical confidence, beginning with the fundamental rule that a submarine caught within an active search pattern must first reduce all machinery noise, then descend quietly to a depth that maximized temperature layer distortion to disrupt enemy sonar accuracy. Hale knew every line of those procedures by heart, remembering the endless drills at New London where instructors repeated that silent running, patient maneuvering, and depth management formed the backbone of effective submarine evasion. According to doctrine, the Marlin should hold her depth, maintain absolute stillness, and wait for the destroyers to widen their search arcs before attempting a cautious turn away from the grid that pinned her beneath the dark surface. Another section of the manual emphasized the importance of never attacking surface escorts while caught inside their sonar envelope, explaining that destroyers enjoyed overwhelming tactical advantages due to superior maneuverability, hardened hull structures, and rapid response capability once alerted to the presence of a submarine. Engaging such ships head-on was described as a reckless gamble, one that left the submarine vulnerable to depth-charge barrages capable of rupturing ballast tanks or crushing compartments within seconds. The torpedo doctrine was even stricter, insisting that American subs should rely on long-range approach angles designed to minimize exposure to counterattacks, encouraging captains to remain at least several thousand yards outside escort screens to ensure firing solutions could be executed without revealing the boat's approximate depth or bearing. Torpedoes were meant to be launched from the shadows, not from beneath the razor-thin blind spots of warships actively sweeping for submarines. Yet as Hale listened to the destroyers reposition overhead, he recognized that textbook tactics depended on conditions far more forgiving than the brutal reality pressing against the Marlin's steel skin. The manuals assumed predictable enemy skill, reliable sonar limitations, and the availability of maneuvering space that simply did not exist here, where the water column was shallow, the seabed uneven, and the Japanese sonar teams unnervingly precise. A small shudder traveled through the hull as another focused ping reverberated along the interior bulkheads, reminding Hale that the destroyers were drawing closer with lethal intent. He glanced toward Ward, who lowered his headphones slightly, revealing eyes strained by the relentless acoustics, screaming through the hydrophones with increasing clarity. Instructors had always insisted that patience saved submarines, but patience now felt like a thin veil masking the inevitability of destruction, because remaining still only allowed the enemy to refine their triangulation until hiding became mathematically impossible. Hale understood that the manual assumed an escape route existed, yet tonight the Marlin had none, trapped in a narrowing funnel shaped by destroyer movements too coordinated to exploit with traditional maneuvers. The engine room reported steady temperatures, but warned that prolonged silent running would eventually compromise lubrication systems, subtly hinting that the ship's own machinery would become a louder enemy than the destroyers if Hale clung to doctrine much longer. Even the navigator, normally unshakable, kept glancing at the chart with a growing awareness that the tight grid overhead might soon compress enough to force a desperate dive into depths the Marlin wasn't built to withstand. As the destroyers tightened their formation, the submarine's training echoed again in Hale's mind, reminding him of the neat diagrams that promised escape through careful discipline. But those diagrams never accounted for a commander with instincts sharpened by months of brutal war, nor for an enemy willing to press their advantage with relentless precision. In that realization, Hale sensed the quiet shift that marked the beginning of a new decision, one that no manual had ever endorsed, but every man aboard silently hoped he was brave enough to make. Despite the rigid doctrines etched into every submarine captain's training, Hale understood that the true enemy pressing against the Marlin's hull was not merely the trio of destroyers above, but the uncomfortable truth that the standard procedures had been crafted for a battlefield that no longer existed. The Pacific had evolved faster than the manuals, transforming into an arena where the Japanese had refined their anti-submarine tactics with a level of precision that eroded the protective assumptions upon which American doctrine quietly depended. The greatest flaw lay in the manual's unwavering belief that thermal layers would distort enemy sonar enough to mask a submarine's outline, yet Hale could practically feel the water around them remaining unnervingly uniform, offering no comforting shift in temperature that might scatter the destroyer's high-frequency beams. Without a reliable layer to hide beneath, the Marlin drifted in water as acoustically clear as glass, making every vibration inside the hull vulnerable to enemy detection. Even more troubling was the destroyer's uncanny ability to coordinate, because the doctrine assumed escorts would sweep independently with overlapping arcs that left exploitable gaps, while tonight the Japanese captains maneuvered with an almost choreographed rhythm that compressed the search pattern until nothing resembling a safe corridor remained. Their synchronized turns revealed a level of discipline suggesting extensive experience hunting American submarines, a chilling indication that they understood the very doctrine Hale had been taught to trust. The manuals had also insisted that silent running would significantly degrade the enemy's situational awareness. Yet Hale recognized that the Japanese sonar operators appeared skilled enough to detect even the faint pressure shifts generated by a stationary hull. Their equipment was newer, their crews were seasoned, and their aggressive behavior indicated they were confident enough to push into ranges where a single accurate ping could expose the Marlin's exact depth. Another problem emerged from within the submarine itself, because the longer the Marlin maintained silent running, the harder her internal systems fought against the strain, causing subtle vibrations that threatened to betray them at the worst possible moment. The chief machinist had already noted rising friction on the port reduction gear, while the forward ballast pump emitted a low hum that seemed harmless to human ears, yet potentially disastrous when magnified through seawater dense with acoustic energy. Hale realized then that the doctrine's core assumption that submarines could always wait out pursuers had collapsed entirely under the weight of the Japanese formation above. Waiting no longer increased their chances of survival. It merely allowed the destroyers to refine their convergence until the Marlin was crushed under precision rather than luck. Silence, once their shield, had become a slow-moving invitation to death. The psychological toll added another invisible pressure, because the doctrine presumed that crews could maintain composure indefinitely, yet Hale could sense frayed nerves spreading through the compartments with every focused ping echoing off the hull. Fear magnified small mistakes, and small mistakes made noise, and noise in this environment carried the same lethality as a direct hit from a depth charge. Most damning of all, however, was the realization that the destroyers now positioned themselves at angles specifically chosen to exploit the Marlin's limited turning space, meaning any attempt to maneuver conventionally would place the submarine directly into the heart of the enemy's predictive grid. The doctrine offered no solution for a trap designed with such intelligence, leaving Hale with a stark truth. Following the manual meant dying exactly as the enemy expected. As another perfectly timed sonar sweep carved through the water, Hale felt the last remnants of traditional strategy crumble, replaced by a clarity born from necessity. The standard methods had failed because they belonged to another war, another ocean, and another generation of submarines. To survive this night, the Marlin would have to abandon the safety of rules and embrace an approach the manuals had never dared to imagine. And in that realization, Hale finally understood that the only path forward required a decision bold enough to break everything he had been taught. Hale stood motionless for several seconds, letting the relentless cascade of sonar pings roll across the hull, while he weighed the impossible truth that had crystallized inside him during the last hour, knowing that clinging to the manual meant allowing the destroyers to dictate every second of the Marlin's fate. The crew waited for him to issue the next standard command, either a slow dive to riskier depths or a cautious turn toward the nearest temperature anomaly. Yet he sensed that neither option would buy them more than a few desperate minutes before the enemy's tightening grid forced them into an unwinnable corner. He glanced toward Ward, who was hunched over the hydrophones with an intensity bordering on pain, listening to the destroyers sharpen their search arcs with a confidence that suggested they believed the submarine was already paralyzed. That assumption, Hale realized, could be the single advantage still available to them, because the Japanese captains undoubtedly expected their prey to behave exactly as doctrine required, silent, passive, and unwilling to challenge surface warships in close quarters. The thought struck him with sudden clarity. If the destroyers believed the Marlin was predictable, then predictability itself had become the deadliest flaw in their strategy. A submarine that followed the manual could be hunted with mathematical precision, but a submarine that broke the rules entirely might achieve something the enemy had not prepared for, disrupting the elegant geometry of the search pattern with a move so counterintuitive that it forced the destroyers into momentary confusion. Hale drew a slow breath, feeling the oppressive stillness inside the control room, shifting as though the air itself sensed his resolve changing, and he studied the bearing plot with a hunter's intensity rather than a prey animal's fear. He traced the destroyers' positions mentally, noting the narrow intervals between sweeps where a fast-executed maneuver could slip beneath their assumptions and push the Marlin into the one location the Japanese sonar officers would never expect: a blind spot directly beneath lead destroyer's hull. Every manual Hale had ever read described that area as a death zone, warning that submerging under a destroyer invited disaster because small course corrections by the surface ship could crush the submarine or expose it with a single lucky ping. Yet those same manuals also acknowledged, usually in footnotes few officers bothered to memorize, that a destroyer's sonar possessed a narrow vertical cone of near silence beneath its own keel, where beams refracted poorly due to hydrodynamic interference. Hale locked eyes briefly with the helmsman and spoke in a measured tone that carried no hesitation, saying, "Prepare for a high-angle turn to port on my mark." We pushed directly under their lead ship. The helmsman's expression flickered with disbelief, because the idea contradicted every principle of safe submarine maneuvering. But he set his hands firmly on the controls without a word, understanding that hesitation could fracture the delicate unity their survival required. Ward looked up sharply from the hydrophones, confusion tightening his features as he asked, "Sir, are we moving into their center axis?" Hale answered with a calm he did not entirely feel, explaining that the destroyer's synchronized pattern had created a temporary gap beneath the lead vessel, one narrow enough to exploit only if the Marlin acted before the next coordinated turn collapsed the sonar window entirely. The crew absorbed the decision in tense silence, recognizing that they were abandoning the familiar comfort of doctrine and stepping into a maneuver that would either deliver them into the enemy's blind cone or place them directly beneath the full might of a destroyer, already primed to kill. Hale looked across the control room, reading the mixture of fear and trust on every face, and gave the order that would define the next 48 hours of their lives. "Helm, left full rudder. Engines, 1/3 ahead. We're not running anymore. We're going straight through them." As the Marlin began its impossible turn, the entire submarine seemed to inhale at once, bracing for the moment when defiance collided with fate. The Marlin's hull vibrated with a subtle tension as she surged forward, slipping into the narrow wedge between the destroyers with a boldness that felt equal parts brilliance and madness. Yet Hale sensed an emerging alignment between instinct and opportunity as the submarine edged toward the blind cone beneath the lead escort. Ward's voice trembled as he reported shifting bearings, noting that the sonar pulses above had begun to widen slightly, creating a fleeting zone of confusion among the Japanese operators who had not anticipated a sudden lateral approach from their intended target. The control room seemed to pulse with a nervous energy, each man holding his breath as the Marlin advanced into territory no submarine was ever meant to occupy, navigating with delicate precision toward a space where the destroyer's sonar beam fragmented into harmless turbulence. Hale monitored the depth gauge carefully, adjusting by small increments to remain just below the hull turbulence, yet above the dangerous turbulence created by the destroyer's propellers, trusting in the thin band of acoustic distortion he hoped would shelter them from detection. Then, for the briefest instant, the symphony of sonar pings hammering the Marlin's hull suddenly softened, their intensity fading as though muffled by an unseen curtain of water that shielded the submarine from the earlier acoustics. Ward stiffened at the hydrophones, his face tightening with stunned realization as he muttered, "Sir, their lead ship just lost us." The words felt unreal, floating through the red-lit control room like an impossible promise, and for the first time since midnight, the crew allowed themselves to believe the maneuver might actually be working. Hale pressed closer to the bearing plot, observing the destroyer's movements shifting with subtle hesitation that betrayed an unexpected break in their coordinated cadence, suggesting that the flagship's sonar officer was recalibrating with growing uncertainty. The escorts began adjusting their arcs slightly, but the adjustments lacked their earlier confidence, revealing cracks in the pattern that had once appeared flawless. The destroyers were no longer hunting a ghost pinned beneath them. They were searching for a target that had momentarily slipped through their grasp. Recognizing the fragile nature of the blind cone, Hale acted swiftly, ordering a slow rise to firing depth while maintaining the Marlin's position beneath the destroyer's acoustic umbrella, intending to create a firing angle so abrupt and unconventional that the enemy's predictive algorithms would collapse entirely. The crew executed the ascent with disciplined precision, balancing buoyancy against silence as they eased the submarine into a position where torpedoes could be launched with minimal risk of immediate detection. Ward listened intently as the destroyer's sonar sweeps drifted further apart, signaling a growing uncertainty among the Japanese captains who were beginning to question whether the submarine had slipped outside the search grid entirely. That uncertainty bought the Marlin precious seconds, and Hale seized them by ordering the forward tubes to stand by, while calculating an attack vector few would have dared attempt beneath an actively hunting destroyer. The torpedo officer confirmed readiness, his voice steadier than Hale expected, revealing a quiet resolve that matched the commander's calculated defiance. The firing solution was imperfect and dangerously close, yet the angle exploited the destroyer's limited downward awareness, making it almost impossible for the enemy to evade once the torpedoes cleared their tubes. Hale inhaled and gave the order with a low, decisive tone that anchored every man in the room. Fire 1, fire 2. Blay. The torpedoes launched with a muted thud that rippled through the submarine, and for several agonizing seconds, the crew waited in suffocating silence, counting heartbeats until a distant, muffled explosion erupted through the water with a force that shook the deck plates under their feet. Ward gasped into the hydrophones as he shouted, "Direct hit! Destroyer is breaking up!" Aye. In that moment, the realization spread through the Marlin like a shockwave of disbelief turning into electric triumph. The impossible strategy had worked, the doctrine had shattered, and a path none had dared imagine had just opened before them. The shock of the destroyer's sudden disappearance from Ward's hydrophones lingered only a moment before Hale forced himself to analyze the mechanics behind their improbable success, knowing that understanding the physics shaping this engagement would determine whether the Marlin survived the next wave of escorts converging on the blast site. The first clue lay in the way the destroyer's sonar beam had fractured as the submarine slipped beneath its keel, revealing a narrow vertical shadow zone created by the complex interaction between hydrodynamic turbulence, propeller cavitation, and downward acoustic refraction. Although the manuals dismissed this blind cone as too unstable to exploit safely, Hale recognized that its structure was more predictable than instructors admitted, forming whenever a destroyer pushed through water at moderate speed, while projecting a high-frequency search beam angled slightly forward. The turbulent flow beneath the hull disrupted returning echoes, scattering them into a diffuse haze that sonar operators often misinterpreted as background noise, especially during coordinated hunts requiring rapid scanning across multiple bearings. Ward's earlier observation about widening sweeps now made perfect sense because the destroyer's sonar officer had likely noticed a faint anomaly, yet struggled to isolate it within the noisy interference blooming around the ship's hull, ultimately delaying a focus track long enough for the Marlin to slip into the acoustic gap. That single delay, measured in mere seconds, had erased the Japanese captain's confidence and exposed a vulnerability the manuals treated as too dangerous to consider operationally. Beyond the blind cone itself, Hale identified another crucial factor in their success: the torpedo's unusually clean acoustic signatures during the launch, caused by the reduced cavitation from running the engines at minimal thrust while positioned in the calmest portion of the turbulence field. This allowed the Mark 14 torpedoes to travel several dozen yards before the destroyer's sensors could register the subtle hydrodynamic disturbances generated by their approach, creating an ambush window far shorter than enemy crews were trained to expect. Additionally, the firing angle Hale had chosen exploited a geometric weakness in the destroyer's predictive model because the torpedoes traveled along a vector the Japanese officers would never anticipate in a trapped submarine scenario. Instead of retreating or attempting to break away from the pattern, the Marlin had attacked from beneath the escort's keel, a direction so counterintuitive that the destroyer's helm crew had no procedural instinct to maneuver defensively, leaving them effectively blind during the crucial few seconds before impact. Hale's calculations also benefited from the unique acoustic properties of the local water column, where slight salinity variations created microlayers that subtly refracted downward projected sonar beams, adding another degree of distortion that softened the submarine's acoustic outline at precisely the moment it mattered. These microlayers had proven insufficient to mask the Marlin during passive evasion, yet paradoxically enhanced the effectiveness of the bold maneuver once the submarine moved directly into their path. As the control room absorbed these insights, the crew began to understand that their survival was not the result of reckless luck, but the product of physics, geometry, and instinct converging in a perfect storm of improbable alignment. Hale recognized that if they could interpret these environmental cues quickly enough, they might convert the blind cone into a repeatable advantage, transforming an experimental tactic into a weapon capable of dismantling the remaining escorts before they recovered from the initial shock. Another distant explosion, likely debris collapsing under pressure, throbbed through the hull, reminding everyone that the other destroyers were still circling, recalibrating, and preparing to strike with renewed aggression. Yet, amid the growing tension, Hale felt a quiet certainty rising within him, shaped not by desperation but by understanding. The science behind the maneuver was sound, the physics were repeatable, and the enemy would need precious minutes to adjust their strategy. For the first time that night, Hale believed the Marlin might not merely survive this encounter but seize control of it entirely, turning the technical anomalies of the deep into the very tools that would sculpt the legend forming around them. The echo of the destroyer's final rupture had barely faded when Hale steadied himself against the chart table, recognizing that the narrow window created by their unlikely success would close rapidly once the remaining escorts regained discipline and reorganized their search sectors. Ward's hydrophones captured frantic bearings sweeping across the water, revealing that the second destroyer had accelerated sharply while broadcasting a wide-beam sonar pulse meant to reset the grid, a maneuver that signaled both confusion and renewed aggression from the Japanese formation. Hale saw opportunity in that chaos, understanding that the sudden collapse of their coordinated pattern had disrupted the enemy's practice synchronization, forcing individual captains to rely on instinct rather than disciplined procedure. The Marlin's unexpected strike had broken the steady rhythm of their hunt, leaving gaps between the sonar sweeps as each destroyer tried to assert control over a situation that no longer aligned with their rehearsed expectations. He ordered a shallow-angle turn to starboard, slipping the submarine out from beneath the turbulent wake of the sinking vessel and repositioning toward the outer edge of the search grid, where the remaining destroyers were least likely to expect an aggressive submarine maneuver. The helmsman adjusted carefully, threading the Marlin through a narrow valley of acoustically quiet water where the broken wake and falling debris created patches of natural interference that further masked the submarine's movement. Ward tracked the second destroyer's attempts to regain clarity, noting that its sonar beams produced inconsistent returns due to the shifting clutter generated by the expanding debris field. This gave the Marlin a temporary shield, allowing Hale to maneuver into a vector that angled sharply toward the destroyer's weaker aft quadrant, a position rarely exploited because manuals insisted submarines approach from safer, more predictable directions. As they eased into the new bearing, the control room braced again, knowing Hale intended to replicate the impossible shot that had moments earlier torn a hole through the enemy formation. The torpedo officer adjusted gyro settings with meticulous precision, compensating for the shifting layers of water disturbed by the sinking wreck and the erratic movements of the remaining Japanese ships. Hale timed the shot with the patience of a hunter who understood that rhythm mattered as much as angle, waiting until the destroyer initiated a broad sweep to port a motion that briefly created a tail of cone distortion behind its keel. He seized that instant with unwavering conviction, ordering the launch of a single torpedo designed to slip directly into the blind turbulence at the precise moment the destroyer's sonar pointed elsewhere. The control room held its collective breath as the faint thud of the launch rippled through the Marlin, followed by an agonizing stretch of silence measured only by Ward's whispered updates, describing the destroyer's confused attempts to refine its bearings. Moments later, a sharp, resonant explosion cracked through the water, sending a tremor through the submarine's hull that left no doubt the torpedo had found its mark. Ward shouted that the second destroyer's propeller noise had vanished entirely, swallowed by the chaotic rumble of a vessel breaking apart, and an adrenaline-charged wave of belief surged across the crew as they realized the tactic was not an anomaly, but a repeatable method. Hale allowed himself one controlled breath of satisfaction before shifting focus, aware that the final escort would now be operating in full survival mode, turning unpredictable as fear replaced confidence. He plotted another vector immediately, exploiting the broken symmetry of the Japanese formation and moving the Marlin into a flanking position where overlapping wakes and collapsing thermal pockets formed an acoustic maze only a bold commander could navigate. The crew followed each instruction with mechanical precision, energized by the revelation that they had discovered not merely a trick, but a strategy capable of dismantling an entire escort line in less than an hour. As the Marlin surged quietly into its next attack angle, the crew sensed an emerging truth settling over them with electric clarity. The next 40 hours might transform this night from a desperate gamble into a historic rampage, and the submarine, once hunted by a flawless formation, would soon become the unseen predator reshaping the fate of every ship in the convoy, still steaming blindly ahead. The Marlin steadied herself beneath a dense curtain of acoustic clutter as Hale absorbed the implications of their rapidly unfolding victory. Recognizing that the destruction of 2 escorts in such a short span had rewritten the dynamic of the battlefield and granted them an unprecedented leverage few submarines had ever experienced. Ward's hydrophones detected frantic signals flashing between the remaining escort and the convoy flagship, revealing a disjointed stream of orders that betrayed an internal collapse of coordination, normally considered unthinkable among experienced Japanese captains. Hale interpreted these signals with growing clarity, understanding that the surviving destroyer now faced an impossible dilemma, forced to choose between protecting the convoy or hunting the ghost-like attacker that had already demonstrated an ability to strike from angles their training had never addressed. The escort altered course erratically, its sonar sweeps widening in frantic arcs that signaled desperation rather than strategy, leaving the merchant vessels momentarily exposed during the frantic attempt to re-establish control over the kill zone. Seizing that moment, Hale maneuvered the Marlin along the convoy's outer perimeter, threading the submarine through shifting wakes and broken thermal pockets, while maintaining a shallow depth that maximized torpedo efficiency, without compromising stealth. The sonar room radiated with tension as Ward mapped the chaotic symphony above, tracing faint outlines of cargo ships attempting to accelerate despite their heavy loads and sluggish turning radii, revealing clear opportunities for attacks that could cripple the formation before dawn. With the escort still distracted by the sinking destroyer's collapsing debris field, Hale selected a vulnerable freighter drifting dangerously near the convoy's rear flank, knowing its slower speed and outdated acoustic profile made it an ideal first target in their emerging strategy of sequential dismantling. The torpedo fired cleanly, gliding through the turbulent water before striking the freighter amidships, producing a deep, resonant explosion that rolled across the sea like thunder trapped beneath the waves. As fire cascaded across the freighter's fractured hull, Ward reported fresh panic among the remaining ships, describing scattered formation shifts that left several transports exposed, while the escort attempted to consolidate its position. Hale exploited these gaps with cold precision, launching another torpedo spread toward a pair of oil-heavy tankers that had drifted too close together, triggering a secondary detonation that illuminated the water with a violent plume of gasoline-fed fire. The destruction of multiple merchant vessels within minutes forced the remaining escort to abandon any pretense of coordinated defense, turning its sonar exclusively toward the torpedo paths in a frantic attempt to locate the Marlin's firing position. Yet Hale had already adjusted the submarine's heading, steering into a turbulent wake that masked the acoustics long enough to reposition beneath a collapsing thermal shelf, where the shifting salinity muted the destroyer's scanning frequency. News of the Marlin's impossible attacks traveled quickly through the U.S. submarine network once Hale transmitted a coded burst, summarizing the unprecedented tactical breakthrough, prompting several skippers across nearby patrol areas to reevaluate their own engagement assumptions. Commanders who had spent months operating under strict evasion doctrine now contemplated the potential of exploiting the destroyer blind cone, debating whether the maneuver could be replicated in their local conditions or calibrated to counter other escort classes patrolling the region. Within hours, the doctrine-shifting implications of Hale's maneuver began circulating among officers in subpack headquarters, where analysts parsed the acoustic anomalies and sonar data captured during the ambush, realizing with growing astonishment that the strategy could alter the entire landscape of submarine warfare in contested waters. The Marlin, once hunted and nearly cornered, had become a moving laboratory, proving that innovation born under extreme pressure could eclipse years of formal training and alter the balance of power with a single calculated gamble. As Hale prepared the next attack run, he sensed that the shift extended far beyond this night, understanding that the tactic forged beneath crushing danger would soon ripple outward, reaching boats, officers, and engineers who would build upon this discovery and reshape the silent struggle playing out across the Pacific. The Marlin was no longer merely surviving. She was rewriting the rules for every submarine that followed. When the final explosions faded into the early morning haze, The Marlin drifted beneath the devastated convoy, enveloped in a strange quiet that felt almost unreal after the violent cascade of destruction that had unfolded across the last 48 hours. Hale studied the sonar display with methodical calm, ensuring every escort signature had vanished before permitting himself to acknowledge the magnitude of what the submarine had achieved under circumstances that should have guaranteed their annihilation. Ward continued sweeping the hydrophones, carefully mapping the diminishing echoes of ruptured hulls settling into the seafloor, and each fading resonance offered a subtle confirmation that the Japanese formation had collapsed entirely, leaving only scattered debris drifting through the dark water like remnants of a shattered war machine. His voice, still strained from hours of relentless focus, reported no surviving threats, marking the first moment of uncontested silence since the Marlin's desperate maneuver began. Hale ordered a cautious rise to periscope depth, allowing a narrow sliver of morning light to pierce the control room as the periscope broke the surface, revealing a horizon littered with floating cargo, burning oil slicks, and splintered timbers from freighters that had once formed the backbone of a heavily protected convoy. The sight carried a haunting mixture of triumph and grim sobriety, reminding him that victory at sea often resembled a graveyard spread across open water, rather than the decisive clarity recorded in wartime reports. The radio operator prepared the encrypted transmission, summarizing the convoy's destruction, and Hale dictated each confirmed kill with steady precision, naming ship classes, estimated tonnages, and probable sinking coordinates. He included the timestamps and firing vectors for every engagement, ensuring future analysts could trace the logic behind each torpedo spread and understand how the unconventional maneuver exploited acoustic vulnerabilities, previously dismissed as theoretical footnotes. Subpac headquarters received the burst hours later, and analysts spent the night cross-referencing Hale's data with intelligence intercepts, survivor reports, and post-engagement reconnaissance, gradually assembling a coherent picture that validated the Marlin's extraordinary claims. Early Japanese signals intercepted by Allied stations described the disaster in terse, fragmented phrases, noting the sudden disappearance of escorts and the catastrophic losses sustained by the merchant fleet without any warning or detectable approach from the attacking submarine. Weeks later, after Allied forces recovered fragments from lifeboats and captured documents from nearby garrisons, the official Japanese records confirmed the sinking of 10 vessels within a 2-day span, aligning with Hale's meticulous logs down to the approximate minute of each explosion. These documents also revealed internal confusion among Japanese naval officers, who struggled to explain how a single submarine penetrated an escort formation believed nearly impervious to underwater assault. Historians later cited these records as evidence of a critical turning point in the Pacific submarine campaign, showing that tactical innovation, when paired with acute environmental awareness, could dismantle even the most disciplined defensive screens. Several Japanese officers, interviewed after the war, recalled their disbelief upon learning that the same submarine had destroyed both escorts and transports without suffering apparent counterattack, describing the incident as a moment when the sea itself turned against us. 7. As the Marlin withdrew from the wreckage, Hale allowed the full weight of the accomplishment to settle upon him, not as exultation, but as a quiet understanding that their actions would ripple far beyond the horizon they now left behind. The submarine had not merely survived a confrontation that should have ended in its destruction. It had unveiled a weakness that would reshape the silent war beneath the Pacific, validated by records from both sides that confirmed the legend taking form around them. As the Marlin cleared the broken remnants of the convoy and slipped back into deeper water, an almost sacred stillness settled over the submarine, carrying with it the quiet realization that every man aboard had witnessed something far larger than a tactical victory. Hale watched the horizon fade behind them, understanding that the events of the past 48 hours would echo long after the smoke, debris, and drifting oil slicks disappeared beneath the endless motion of the Pacific. The crew moved with a subdued reverence through the narrow passageways, acknowledging in subtle glances that they had crossed a threshold few submariners ever approached, transforming a desperate gamble into a profound demonstration of what courage, instinct, and innovation could achieve under suffocating pressure. They understood that their survival had not come from superior machinery or doctrinal advantage, but from a decision to break the very rules that were supposed to keep them alive. Hale reflected on that paradox with a steady calm, recognizing that the blind cone tactic had emerged not from recklessness but from the rare moment when intuition aligned perfectly with the physics of the deep, revealing a truth the manuals had never accounted for. Sometimes, the safest path in warfare was the one no one believed a sane commander would attempt. In that realization, he sensed the beginnings of a new kind of doctrine shaped not by comfortable theory but by lived necessity. As word of the Marlin's achievement circulated through the submarine fleet, young officers began studying Hale's engagement logs, with an intensity usually reserved for legendary battles, searching each diagram and annotation for insights capable of guiding their own survival.